Our next guest to help us break down the Ukraine situation. He is a contributor to the Gray Zone and winner of the I.F. Stone Izzy Award for Independent Journalism and the host of Pushback. You can read his work at his Substack, mate.substack.com. Please welcome award-winning journalist Aaron Mate. Hello, Aaron.
Hi, JD.
Great to have you on. So we're going to do this. So it's happened. Russia has officially invaded the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine. And so Joe Biden is on it, though. Listen to this.
I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure. I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure.
I don't know what he said. Let's hear it one more time.
I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure. I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure.
Okay. So what I want to do here, there's a lot of moving parts in the Ukraine thing. There's a lot of things. There's a gas pipeline. Of course, energy comes into play. We're going to talk about that. Of course, what happened with NATO, the NATO's expansion onto Russia's border, that also plays into this in a big thing. Also, the 2014 coup that the United States pushed and then installed a government that is infiltrated with neo-Nazis and outwardly, that's not a secret. And then the Minsk agreement that then the Ukrainian government ignored. So all those things led us to Russia doing this, right? Going in and putting troops into Ukraine. So people keep forgetting that all this history, and so there's been a lot of bad takes. Usually we debunk the establishment news. Well, even YouTubers are now doing the same thing, repeating what the corporate news has been saying. And I wanted to just show you two examples, and then we'll debunk it and show you how you should actually be thinking about this. So the first one comes from a friend of the show, Kyle Kalinske. He said Biden didn't go extreme with the sanctions because he's now sanctioning Russia over this, President Biden. He went proportional. Okay. No doubt, though, that if Russia takes or tries to take Kiev, the harshest sanctions are in play. Overall, a relatively reasonable response policy-wise, in my opinion, despite Western culpability in getting to this point. And what you said was that you're presuming that the United States has a moral or legal authority that in reality doesn't exist. What right does Biden have to sanction anyone? He doesn't. The United States just set the Mideast on fire. We're still bombing Yemen, Somalia, as we speak, and Israel is still bombing Syria with our blessings. A single sanction on anyone but him or other U.S. leaders is out of proportion. He can start by sanctioning his team for the 2014 Maidan coup, and that's the coup where we helped overthrow the Ukrainian democratically elected government in 2014. That's the United States did that, and we showed you how they did that in our last video about this with Max Blumenthal. So here's one more take I wanted to show you because a lot of people turn to them, and they forget that Sagar is actually a right-winger. So people forget this, and they also forget that Crystal Ball also is a Russiagator, right? So then here's what you get. Here's the kind of analysis you get from that.
I never expected a full-scale invasion like this to happen. I was deeply distrustful of U.S. military intelligence, and frankly, I think I got it wrong in terms of what happened here. I never expected Putin and Russia in order to do something so, frankly, colossally foolish. He has fulfilled the dreams of the neocons now in Washington for all time. He is basically ensured now, Crystal, as we'll be discussing throughout the entire show, a full-scale NATO deployment to the eastern flank. This is the greatest thing that could have ever happened to the U.S. defense budget. I mean, there will now be renewed justified calls. Already I'm seeing this morning the German former defense minister and others saying they're going to be re-upping their armaments. So we are looking at a whole new era of geopolitics here. And it is entirely Putin's fault.
And China sort of tacitly aligning with Russia.
Yep, that's right.
Basically calling for, lessening of hostilities all around. So this very, wishy-washy, both sides kind of a statement, when clearly 100% the aggressor here is Putin and is Russia.
Okay, so that just, ignores the history of what's happening and it reveals that they don't know it. But so why did the U.S. back a violent coup in Ukraine against an elected government? Why did the U.S. and EU support neo-Nazi militias? Why were they silent about the attacks on Russia-speaking civilians in Donbass? Why haven't any of these questions been asked by the cheerleading Western media? And so I'll just show you one more video. This is from Adam
United
Schiff.
States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
So we've been arming and funding the people fighting Russia and breaking the Minsk Accords in Donbass since 2014 at least. And here's what you say. Again, people don't ever focus on this either. Biden rejected Russian offers to keep Ukraine neutral and helped sabotage the Minsk Accords, which could have prevented this war. Since he's now hanging Ukraine out to dry, perhaps Kyiv can hire Hunter Biden for $80,000 a month for his expertise on how to navigate his dad's crisis. So let me bring in Aaron. Before I do, I just want to just show you this. So again, this is the thing nobody ever talks about. I was there, NATO and the origins of the Ukraine crisis. After the fall of the Soviet Union, I told the Senate that expansion will lead us to where we are today. And who said that? Jack F. Matlock Jr. That's a guy who was there when it happened. And he says Putin's demand is that the process of adding new members to NATO cease and that Russia has assurance that Ukraine and Georgia will never be members. President Biden has refused to give such assurance, but made clear his willingness to continue discussing questions of strategic stability in Europe. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has made it clear it has no intention of implementing the agreement reached in 2015 for reuniting the Donbass province into Ukraine with a large degree of local autonomy, an agreement with Russia, Germany, and France that was endorsed by the United States. So that's what's led us to here. And you didn't hear any of that in any of those two critiques I just showed you. And I'll show you one more video and I'll bring in Aaron Mate. Here's Chomsky talking about this.
The question that we ought to be asking ourselves is, why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a U.S.-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global U.S. intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we can go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
So let me bring in Aaron Mate, who you can read at mate.substack.com, and we just react to the bad news reports and what's actually going on and anything I got wrong.
Well, you got nothing wrong. Look, in terms of this Russian invasion, which is going on all over Ukraine, Russia is attacking military sites. across Ukraine. It looks like tonight they're attacking the capital, Kiev. And I think the first thing to say about that, and that we have to acknowledge that, is that no matter the background, it is illegal. There is a UN charter which allows force only under a few conditions, either if you're under attack in self-defense or in the face of an imminent invasion. And that wasn't the case here when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. And Russia has claimed to care about the UN charter. And I think in this case, they completely violated it. And although I understand their reasons, and they didn't start this crisis, they didn't actually start this war, I think they had other options. Putin has control over a large part of the European energy system, and Russia had leverage to achieve its goals that way. He could have pursued that. He could have pursued other things.
You mean he could have? You mean he could have cut off energy shipments to Eastern Europe, and that would have been his leverage?
That's one thing he could have tried. You know, okay. I'm not sure if it would have worked, but he could have tried that. So this, you know, he likes to argue, or you know, the Kremlin likes to argue that they had no other choice. But I just don't buy that. Now, that doesn't mean though that they started this war. This war did not begin this week. That's a point that my colleague Anya Parampil made this week. The war did not begin with the Russian attack on Ukraine. This war really began in 2014 when the U.S. backed a coup in Russia's neighbor. And that's a documented fact. I mean, you played the clip before where you have Victoria Nuland, a top Obama and now Biden official, who's choosing the next leadership of Ukraine. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, that's exactly who came in power after the president Yanukovych was violently overthrown. That's a coup. And I'm sure in many years from now, once we get the declassified documents, we'll find out even more about how involved the U.S. was. So shortly after that, you had a war breakout because even after a coup that ousted the government of Yanukovych, then the new coup government started cracking down on Russian-speaking people, banned Russia as a language. And there was incidents like in Odessa in 2014, where dozens of people were burned alive. Russian speakers were burned alive.
By Nazis.
By Nazis. And after that, that's what prompted the separatist regions, or I'm sorry, these rebel regions, Russian-speaking, Russian-aligned regions, to launch a rebellion because they didn't want to live under the reign of Nazis who threatened to burn them alive. And there's been a brutal war for the last 8 years in which the vast majority of the casualties have occurred on the rebel-held side. And it's those people, the victims of that war, that we're not allowed to acknowledge. It goes back to a term that Chomsky used with Edward Herman in Manufacturing Consent. There are worthy and unworthy victims. Worthy victims are the victims of U.S. enemies. Unworthy victims, people who we can't acknowledge, are the ones who were responsible for killing. And throughout this 8-year war, the U.S. has been pumping Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of weapons. Just imagine if Russia had done in Mexico what the U.S. did in Ukraine. Launch a coup and then fled the country with billions of dollars worth of weapons. The only difference is that the U.S. would have done what Russia just did a long time ago.
A long time ago.
They would not have waited. So that's the background.
I mean, look what we did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that was, what, 60 years ago? I mean, we weren't going to allow Russia to put missiles in Cuba, and so we were, you know, almost had World War III over it. And so you're exactly right. We would have did what Putin did, but much quicker.
Yeah. When Blinken and Biden talk about the rules-based international order, right? That's their mantra.
Yes.
Russia is following, according to U.S. terms, the rules-based international order, where you use force to protect your own interests. That's what the U.S. does. The U.S. claiming, accusing someone else of violating their sovereignty is a joke. U.S. right now is occupying of Syria. Syria does not want U.S. troops there. But we don't even talk about that because it just presumed, like some people presume that we have the right to sanction other countries, that we can do whatever we want. So Russia is simply following the terms that the U.S. has already laid down as, quote, the rules-based international order, except the difference between Russia and the U.S. is that Russia is doing it on their borders. Syria is not on the U.S. border.
That's right.
Yet U.S. is occupying it. Ukraine is not on the U.S. border. Yet the U.S. launched a coup there and has sent billions of dollars worth of weapons there. There's a broader background that's been happening over the last 30 years. As you mentioned, the expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders. Also, and this never gets talked about, but it's very important. There's been a continuous dismantling by the U.S. of the arms control agreements reached during the Cold War that essentially prevented the world from destruction. The Bush administration kicked it off while they were expanding NATO to Russia's borders in 2002, 2003, they killed the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And they said at the time that they needed to do this to protect Europe from Iranian missiles, which is a complete joke. The obvious aim was to build facilities in places like Poland that the US can use to encircle Russia. That's the aim. And that's been continued. And in 2007, Vladimir Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference where he warned that along with NATO expansion, the destruction of these arms control accords is threatening a lot of danger and that Russia is eventually going to have to respond. The US ignored all that. The following year, Ukraine was promised NATO membership along with Georgia. And fast forward to 2014, you had that coup, and you had the coup government talking about joining NATO. You also had, in the years since the coup happened, Trump pulling out of the INF Treaty, another vital Cold War arms control treaty, and also killing the Open Skies Treaty. So you have a coup in Ukraine, you have nonstop expansion of NATO, and you have killing of arms control treaties that keep the peace and that allow for the US to build up even more offensive weapon systems surrounding Russia. And it's in that context that Russia started building up its forces late last year and started making demands and laid down a very clear red line. And Putin was serious about this. He threatened military technical measures. He didn't say what they were, but it's obvious now what he meant. Now, I didn't think he would invade. I was wrong about that. He was serious when he said that NATO expansion has to stop, that we can't allow for a Ukraine, which has a lot of traditional ties to Russia, to be a NATO member and to host US offensive weapons. And what was the US response? Even though they supposedly had all this intelligence pointing to a Russian invasion, they were willing to hang Ukraine out to dry and say, no, it's more important for us to assert this stupid right to expand a hostile, useless military alliance than it is to save Ukraine from a catastrophe. Because, by the way, we're not going to help Ukraine at all if they get invaded, which is exactly what's happened.
That's exactly. So there's another part to this, too, that people leave out. First of all, this is your tweet, which I thought was great. You say, for the U.S. project of turning Ukraine into a vassal state while pretending to care about its sovereignty, you couldn't have picked a worse face than the guy who helped organize the coup of 2014 and then got his son a lucrative gas company board seat in the immediate aftermath. And here's one more, since we're talking about the bad coverage. Caitlin Johnstone says, the fact that Western media cover Ukraine in a wildly different way from U.S.-led wars is actually immensely important and points to a problem that urgently needs attention. Anyone who has a problem with that should shut the F up and stop interrupting adult conversations. So I want to show you this. So this is another part. Of course, there's a pipeline involved. Of course, there's got to be some energy involved, some oil, some gas, something. And so this is from the American Prospect, and it says Nord Stream pipeline snarled in the U.S.-Russia fossil energy war. But this is from last December, right? So this discarded sanctions over Nord Stream were attempted protectionism for U.S. gas producers. So they're trying to – so what is happening is Russia sells, I think, 30%, maybe even 40% of the energy supply to Europe, and that's not good for the United States, right? And so they want to protect our gas interests. It's selling to Europe. This is real. So watch this. So there's a pipeline. It's called Nord Stream 2, and the pipeline was built to send gas directly from Russia to Germany, bypassing Ukraine and removing a source of income, as well as a strategic choke point for the former Soviet state. In May, President Biden lifted sanctions that Congress and former President Donald Trump placed 2 years ago. Remember, Trump was supposed to be in bed with Putin? Here he was sanctioning their frickin' pipeline, and which was 95% complete when Biden took office. It was finished in September, and now it awaits certification from German regulators. Echoing criticisms are Ted Cruz. He warned that Russian President Vladimir Putin has built the pipeline so then the Russian tanks can ride into Ukraine. Now, why would Ted Cruz want to say that? Well, the senator from the Permian Basin, who has emerged as the pipeline's toughest critic, has another reason to oppose the infrastructure for Russian gas, preserving the European export market for U.S. liquefied natural gas. So, oh my God. So there you go. So they wanted to stop that pipeline from Europe to Germany, a direct pipeline that goes around, that cuts out Ukraine. And they wanted to stop that. Why? Because there's a big liquefied natural gas market for the United States there. And beyond Texas, senators from other oil-producing states, such as North Dakota. Isn't that interesting that big oil-producing states have slammed the pipeline, also citing national security? The strategic priority makes sense, given that the U.S. outflanks Russia as the top exporter of natural gas. Despite the pandemic, U.S. producers in 2020 saw the highest natural gas exports on record. So this is about gas money, baby, fossil fuels. Freedom gas, remember, as Energy Secretary Rick Perry dubbed the fuel, has been explicitly pitched to European producers in recent years as an alternative to Russian energy. Perry, who is also the former governor of Texas, told reporters in 2019 that after freeing Europe from Nazis, the United States is again delivering a form of freedom to the European continent. This time, he said, rather than in the form of young American soldiers, it's in the form of liquefied natural gas. Freedom gas, baby. Now, even as it looks to decarbonize its power sector long term, Germany plans to ramp up its reliance on gas over the next decade. The country's new governing coalition, which includes the Green Party and the pro-business FDP, they have agreed to build gas-fired power plants as it aims to retire coal by 2030. Expectations of Nord Stream's impact on global demand for liquefied gas could influence the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the regulator that approves gas drilling facilities. So what they're saying is that they're afraid that the Federal Regulatory Agency that approves gas drilling facilities might not approve them if there isn't the market for it in Europe, right? So that's what they're afraid of. Okay. Those expectations were jolted on Tuesday after a call between Biden and Putin. The United States would be willing to use the pipeline as leverage against Putin's military buildup on the border of Ukraine. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters at a press conference. Sullivan added, if Vladimir Putin wants to see gas flow through the pipeline, he may not want to take the risk of invading Ukraine. So you know we don't give a shit about the people of Ukraine. So what is our strategic interest? Well, there's one of them. In Europe, the debate over U.S. sanctions is viewed as a play not only for energy security, but for lucrative energy markets, violating territorial sovereignty even as they claim to preserve it. Sanctions are an aggressive instrument in a fossil energy war, says Claudia Kempfert, an energy economist at DIW Berlin. She told the German newspaper Handelsblatt. She said both Russia and the United States are using natural gas as a political weapon. So now you know the rest of the story. So, Aaron, can you confirm this for me? So now I saw a news report. Tell me if you can confirm this, that the reason, so when Biden lifted the sanctions that Trump had on that pipeline, he said, okay, Germany, you can start doing your pipeline and have gas flow, but under the condition that if Russia assaults Ukraine militarily, you have to stop your gas coming from. Now, is that part of that? So maybe that's why you find out that Joe Biden didn't want to negotiate. Maybe you find out that's why they've been letting this happen. Maybe that's why you find out the United States actually wanted this to happen. And they're glad that Putin did this in a sense, because now they get to stop that Nord Stream pipeline. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, let me add one more motive to this U.S. aim to block Nord Stream 2. So on top of the fact that, they help gain more profits for the U.S. energy industry, there's another added bonus that they can block Nord Stream 2. They prevent Russia from being further integrated into the rest of Europe.
That's right.
And if you're a hegemon and you thrive off constant confrontation, and Russia is one of your prime enemies, and Russia is a deterrent to U.S. hegemony, having Russia being more integrated with the rest of Europe is a disaster, because it reduces the chance of conflict. It means people will be less likely to get on board with you as you try to impose more sanctions or even try to start a war. So blocking this gas pipeline, I think, was a very high priority for U.S. hegemony, not just because of energy industry profits at home, but also just because it helps enforce the U.S.-run system. And on your point about did this factor into Biden's agenda, I think it's totally reasonable to speculate, especially given what we know now. When Biden took office, something happened inside Ukraine that hasn't gotten reported very much, but it's worth paying attention to. It was reported by Time magazine a few weeks ago by a journalist named Simon Schuster. He reported that as soon as Biden came in, Zelensky offered what a top aide to Zelensky called a, quote, welcome gift to Biden. And that was shutting down the three main opposition TV networks, all of them aligned with Russia, taking them off the air. And that's a move that the U.S. embassy at the time cheered as a wonderful move, which is an odd reaction when supposedly we're supposed to believe that Ukraine is a democracy. But the Zelensky aide is saying that this was done as a welcome gift to the Biden administration to fit with their agenda. Not long after that, the opposition leader inside Ukraine, the main opposition leader for the pro-Russian party, he was put under house arrest. And all this was done to please the Biden administration. Why would the Zelensky administration go out of its way to take opposition pro-Russian television networks off the air to please the Biden administration? Well, the answer is if the Biden administration wants a confrontation with Russia. And Time magazine also reports that not long after all these things happened, Putin saw this as a direct assault on him because his allies in Ukraine were being attacked. And that's when the first of the Russian forces sent to the border started amassing. This is in 2021. So you can actually speculate that the first Russian forces to start gathering on the border were a reaction to the crackdown inside Ukraine that was inspired by the Biden administration. Fast forward to more recently, some other interesting things have happened that have not gotten very much attention. There have been these talks for a long time under something called the Normandy Formula, convened by France, Germany, and Britain to basically try to save the Minsk Accords. That's the peace agreement that was reached in 2015, 7 years ago, that would solve the fighting in the Donbass. The basic bargain is the pro-Russian regions demilitarize, they give up their weapons. In exchange, they get autonomy. Now, if they have autonomy, it means one bad thing for Washington neocons and far-right fascists in Kiev. It means that Ukraine can't join NATO. So basically, Minsk would ensure that Ukraine is at peace and neutral, which I think is a very fair bargain given you have a divided country. And it's insane to put a hostile military alliance on Russia's borders. But the U.S. has put no pressure at all on Ukraine to implement those accords, even though Ukraine signed on to them.
You mean the Minsk Accords?
The Minsk Accords, yeah.
Right.
And so up until a few weeks ago, there were talks under the Normandy Formula to try to save Minsk. And what happened at the most recent round of talks, basically a week ago, what happened? Zelensky announced that he would refuse to negotiate anymore with the rebels. So he would no longer be negotiating with the side that he's fighting. And if you're not going to negotiate with the side you're fighting, then there will be no peace. So contrary to everyone saying that Putin has sabotaged Minsk and all this stuff, it was Zelensky who decided to sabotage Minsk. Now, he faces some pressure at home. There are far-right pro-Nazi forces that have held demonstrations where they threatened to Maidan coup Zelensky if he makes peace. So he is under pressure. But the problem is the U.S., if they wanted to, could step in and say, we have Zelensky's back. We support the Minsk Accords. And that would send a very strong signal to tell the far right to go away because the U.S. has a lot more power, but they haven't. And there's no way Zelensky would have negotiate with the rebels, get either the blessing or a direct order from Washington. So Zelensky, and with Washington's blessing, sabotaged diplomacy right up until the end, even though Putin had all those troops, even though there was the prospect, obviously realized, of a Russian invasion. The prospect of making peace with Russia and offering a neutral Ukraine just couldn't be tolerated inside Washington. And that's why we have the disaster that we're in now. There's one more thing, too. Zelensky went to the Munich Security Conference a few days ago, and he said that Ukraine will possibly pursue nuclear weapons once again.
Yes, I saw that. It's crazy.
It's crazy. And so, I don't know exactly what Putin calculated. Maybe he's been planning to do this for months. It's also possible that in the end he snapped and he said, fuck it, these people, there's no hope with these people. And he just went ahead and did it. But regardless, the US had multiple opportunities to prevent war. And at every step of the way, they encouraged confrontation.
And so what do you, so he's going to Kyiv, or I still like to say Kiev. He's going to Kiev. So is he just going to occupy the whole country? I thought he would just try to secure the Donbass and protect those people who are being slaughtered by the Nazis.
Yes.
That's what I thought. But he's actually going to Kiev. And what do you think his end game is?
Yeah. And by the way, Jimmy, you know, when we talked before about what other options Putin had, that's another one. If you really feel like you have to use force, that's the only way to protect these civilians in the Donbass who, again, we have to say they've been under heavy shelling for 8 years, and they exist, and their suffering and their death is real, and they're ignored completely. If he really felt force was the only answer, he could have just gone there to protect them, but he didn't. He went a lot farther, and now he's in Kiev, and I have no idea what Russia's plans are. But look, a lot of people are suffering. People are fleeing the country. It's awful. War is terrible, and that's why it should be avoided at all costs. But insofar as we care about our own government and our role in stopping wars, we should have been demanding for years that the U.S. basically reverse its coup policy, allow Ukraine to be neutral, stop insisting on bringing Ukraine into NATO, when we also knew, by the way, it never would even happen because France and Germany are very opposed to it, and encouraging, pressuring Kiev, using leverage we have to make peace. Instead, Biden treated Ukraine as a personal piggy bank, where he was so influential back in 2014 that Burisma felt the need to give Hunter Biden, who is, let's just say, is not an energy expert, a lucrative board seat. That tells you something about how powerful Joe Biden was. And after that, in the years since, you know, the Obama administration and then the Trump administration, instead of making peace, Trump actually flooded Ukraine with even more weapons than Obama did. Obama, after launching the coup, had some sense. He realized, oh shit, I've just launched a war and the people we're arming are neo-Nazis, and I don't want to further inflame that. So he resisted calls from all over Washington, including from Bill Taylor, who, if you remember, he was one of the stars of Trump's impeachment, who was urging Obama to send more weapons to Ukraine. And he called Obama's policy of not sending weapons appeasement. Well, Trump came into office and everybody was calling him a Russian agent. So he has no principles. So he said, sure, I'll show him I'm not a Russian agent, and I'll send them all the weapons they want. It didn't matter anyway. But it did have the impact of making this proxy war even worse. And now we're in this today. And nobody on the not nobody, but look how hard it is for people from Bernie Sanders on down.
Bernie Sanders. So
acknowledge that there was a coup. And it's on tape. This is not.
This isn't a speculation. This isn't our conspiracy. This is a fact. We know what happened.
But people are so, I don't know what it is, Jimmy. They're afraid of being called a Russian agent. They have other agendas. I don't know, but people are not willing to speak the truth. And it's weakening the progressive position. It makes it's like if you concede all the talking points,
I know,
to the neocons, then you don't have much to work with.
I know it's what that we've seen this time and time and time again, Aaron, and that's why there's no left in America. I keep telling people, we're a right-wing country for a reason, because the lefties like to repeat CIA talking points on the regular, and they're nutless wonders who will never stand up, and they will always fall down for the easiest infiltration tactics by the left. I just want to show you some reactions. Here's Richard Wolf says, it's security threatened. U.S. invaded Afghanistan, Iraq, far from U.S. borders. It's security threatened. Russia interferes in next door Ukraine. Differences, yes, and similarities too. This is from Benjamin Norton. Russia's intervention in Ukraine has gotten much more coverage and condemnation in just 24 hours than the U.S.-Saudi war on Yemen has gotten since it started nearly 7 years ago. 377,000 Yemenis have died. U.S.-backed Saudi bombing, now the worst since 2018. Nobody talks about that. People talk about how Biden has somehow the moral authority to sanction another country as he's occupying Syria, committing a genocide in Yemen, and bombing Somalia, with plus all the other shit they're doing. Okay. It's the height of American exceptionalism to be actively participating in multiple genocides across the globe and to think you are the moral superior to anyone. So let me see what else we have. Alan McLeod says, the outrage you're feeling now is the outrage you should feel when the United States bombs or occupies a country, which is every day. That's very well said. Here's one more. Saying the U.S. government is still a far worse offender in the mass military slaughter department than Russia will be met with hysterical shrieking and the rending of garments now, but it's still indisputably true, and if you disagree with it, it's because you're propagandized. It's 100% true. Opposing NATO and standing for its disbandment, understanding the geopolitical history of Ukraine, nor remembering the constant attacks on its own people by Ukrainian armed forces and militia in separatist areas does not make one pro-Putin. Very well said. There's a few more.
Jimmy, by the way, listen.
Go ahead.
It's, there's also not a fair comparison even between what Russia is doing right now and what the U.S. has done elsewhere. Again, first of all, we understand the reasons behind what Russia is doing. I'm not justifying it, but there are reasons. And it is a much different situation than the U.S. going across the world, not on its borders, to launch military missions like in Iraq and Syria. Russia is doing this on its borders in a country where it has deep historical ties and where there's a whole people who speak Russian and identify with Russia. But even tactically and target-wise, as we're speaking so far, and this could change, of course, Russia could kill many civilians. As we're speaking right now, Russia has so far targeted military sites. So far, as we're speaking. When the U.S. goes into Iraq, Libya, Syria, they're not targeting military sites. They're destroying whole cities, like in Fallujah, in Raqqa, in Mosul, decimating them. Thankfully, we have not seen that so far inside Ukraine. We have seen, there, of course, have been some civilian casualties. Some civilian buildings have been hit, but at least from as I understand it, and if I get this wrong, if I turn out to be wrong in the end, I will totally apologize. But as of right now, the main targets have been military.
So here's one more tweet. If for 25 years I warn you not to cage a badger and you do it and the badger finally lashes out, don't call me a badger apologist. Here's from Garland Nixon, friend of the show. Woke warmonger Democrats, love and prayers to Ukrainian Nazis. F the poor people in Yemen, Iraq, and Libya. Look at this. So it says, Putin's decision to invade Ukraine offers an unexpected opportunity for the United States to deal decisively with Russia in a way that always advances U.S. strategic objectives in Asia. Caitlin Johnstone says, oh, well, that's a lucky coincidence. Turns out it worked to America's advantage to refrain from taking the zero-cost step of promising not to add a country to NATO that it never wanted to add anyway in order to prevent this war. Here's one more. We'll go one more from her. She says, I wonder if the U.S. having solid intelligence that refusing to make this zero-cost move would provoke a war that benefits U.S. hegemonic interests had anything to do with their refusing to make that zero-cost move. I'm not exactly sure where everybody has been living, but our government didn't care about the Kurds, doesn't care about women in Afghanistan, and doesn't care about the people of the United States. They don't even, and about the people of Ukraine, they don't even care about the people in America. That's 100%. And here's my favorite. If you don't support Ukrainian Nazis, you're a right-winger. So that's how we're going to cover it here at the Jimmy Dore Show with the help of award-winning journalist Aaron Mate. If there's anything else you'd like to add to today's segment?
Let me add one more thing. The person who I think laid out best exactly what has happened was William Burns, who is the current director of the CIA. And back in 2008, he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a cable that we know of thanks to WikiLeaks. So thank you, Julian Assange, titled Net Means Yet, where he reported his conversations with top Russian officials who told him very clearly that this ongoing NATO expansion is a red line for Russia and that Russia is one day going to react. This is back in 2008. And one of the reasons that they laid out for why they will have to react is they said that if Ukraine is given NATO membership, that will definitely divide the country, possibly spark a civil war, and that will force Russia, given its deep historical, cultural, economic family ties, to choose a side and possibly intervene on its side. That was a warning back in 2008 from William Burns to the Obama administration. And it's exactly what has happened. And so the U.S. has known the consequences of its policy ever since, but they've continued to pursue it. And the saddest part is, for all this talk about standing by Ukraine and caring about Ukraine, they had no intention ever of defending Ukraine once Russia ultimately launched the response that the U.S. provoked. And that's exactly what's happened. They've essentially let Ukraine be taken over by, in the armed forces at least, by a strong contingent of neo-Nazis. That's a dominant force inside Ukraine, thanks to U.S. support. And they've let Ukrainians be used as cannon fodder in their proxy war with Russia. And that just makes this thing all the more criminal.
Agreed. Here we're doing stand-up in Houston and Dallas on the 24th and the 22nd of March, and we're doing stand-up in Los Angeles March 4th and 6th. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all our live shows.